the Mint Door Podcast with Dr. Karen Tyndall and Dr. Laura Schwint. Are you tired of the burnout cycle? Well, it's time to serve sustainably without sacrificing your well-being. The Mint Door's elite performance coaching can help you cultivate a holistic approach to your well-being, enhance your leadership and self-mastery skills, and optimize your life for success, personal and professional fulfillment. So don't put your true best self potential on hold any longer. Begin now by scheduling a complimentary Minty Moment Impact Chat and embody your radiance today. So now, tune in for the Mint Door Podcast, where we unlock the secrets to cutting-edge innovation, peak performance, and transformative leadership. And today we're bringing you a catalyst for change, true architect of achievement, a leader who forges teams of champions. Prepare to be inspired by Steve Craig. Now, this isn't just another industry authority. We're talking about a multi-award-winning people-first strategist. With over 2 decades navigating the DSO and dental partner landscape, Steve has perfected the art of cultivating cohesive, high-impact teams. He empowers individuals and he distills complexity into clarity. He spearheads special markets at Solmetex, a company revolutionizing dental water solutions. And let's face it, water, it's the cornerstone of your practice, this vital resource, the very essence of patient care. Steve champions, and we wholeheartedly agree, that every single drop matters. He's dedicated to safeguarding dental water for patients, for practices, and our environment. In an industry brimming with opportunities, Steve Craig is leading the charge, and he's inviting you to join the movement. So prepare to be ignited, prepare to be challenged, and prepare to elevate your practice with Steve Craig. Let's unlock the door. Well, welcome to the Mint Door Podcast. Listeners, we are here today with Steve Craig. Steve, welcome to the Mint Door Podcast. I am so excited to get into this conversation with you and grateful that you're spending some time with us.
I'm grateful that you asked me to spend some time. So we had an incredible conversation once before, and now we'll continue that conversation. So I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I know. We were just saying that we should have recorded that first conversation, and that could have been the podcast, but we didn't. And so here we are.
Get a chance. Yeah, we wouldn't get a chance to speak a second time then, right?
There you go. I guess it all works out.
That's
awesome.
Right.
Well, my first question for you is, this is the Behind the Mask podcast. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of talk a little bit, go a little deeper into some questions. And my first question is, what insecurities have you hidden maybe behind your professional mask? And how have those insecurities shaped who you are today?
Yeah, I can think of a couple, but as we had talked last time, I started out as my career in sales and then, morphed into leadership. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the insecurities is when you enter leadership, you're not really trained to do that. Mm-hmm. A lot of time organizations will take either the best performer and promote them to leadership, but it's something that's never really developed. You kind of have to go out and develop yourself. So I think, insecurities would be, one day you're kind of the peer, the next day you're the leader. So you have a lot of insecurities around that of you've never been trained for that position. You're trying to really find your own way. I think also you try to be someone that you're not. You've probably had a lot of leaders in your life. I believe you can learn just as much from the poor leaders as you can from the good ones. But I think a lot of times we try to take one of our best coaches, our best leaders, and try to copy them, which a lot of times doesn't really work out, because what makes them unique and what makes them who they are is what makes them who they are. And it may not be the same for you. So I think there's a lot of insecurity around that of you were never really trained for this position. You're now in front of everybody trying to lead them, inspire and coach them and develop them. You're a lot of times trying to emulate somebody. And I think you believe you should know everything.
Mm,
And that's really not the job of a leader to know everything. But in the very beginning, when you enter that world, that's what you think. You think you have to copy someone, you have to know everything, and it a lot of times backfires on you. So I think that is probably one of the biggest insecurities when you first start off in that leadership role. Most people struggle with.
mm. As you were saying that, I mean, you took me right back to my early days as an owner doc
Hmm.
and exactly how I felt.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I think you go to dental school and, that's always been the big debate of they don't teach us leadership schools when you're at dental school. But, I think some of it also is you probably wouldn't be prepared for it if they did. And you're really focused more on the clinical hand speed, those type of things that even if they taught it to you then, you kind of don't know what you don't know at that point. And a lot of people don't get into dentistry to become a leader. They probably want to own their own practice, but they kind of separate those two things.
Mm,
And so I can definitely see how you felt that way. And me being more on the vendor side, it's the same thing.
mm,
You get into sales, and then one day they tap you on the shoulder to move up into leadership, and a lot of times you're not prepared for it. And I think whether it's in a practicing dentist or on my side, anything you can get out of an organization is icing on the cake, but you can never really wait for an organization to develop you. You have to develop
mm,
yourself. So I think you have to take ownership in that and try to absorb and learn as much as you can and realize that there's going to be trials and errors. Some things are going to go great, and some things, unfortunately, are not going to go great. And I think one of the hardest things like I said in the very beginning, was, you don't know everything. You're going to make mistakes, and you just have to be humble enough also to ask for help,
mm,
whether that be above or below you.
mhm, mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good in the sense that I think that, especially when you're put in these positions, you sort of feel like you're supposed to know everything.
Hmm.
And leading up to that, maybe you did know everything because you were at the pinnacle of a different position, right?
Correct.
And then you get put in this leadership role and think that you're supposed to. But I love what you said about not waiting for development to come from someone else, but really taking that ownership on yourself.
Hmm. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that comes from once you are elevated or once you become a practice owner,
Mm-hmm.
that's when you start doing it. It's hard to prepare for that before because you're in a different position, something totally different. So hopefully, leaders will start training the replacements.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best way to do it. So you have people ready to do that. And it's a difference of, now you're winning through others versus winning through yourself. And you really, and there's a lot of leaders that, and a lot of star employees that probably should never be a leader. They really have that I mentality versus we,
Mm-hmm.
and they want the limelight. And I think the most effective leaders that I've seen or interacted with, they're going to give all the success to the team, and they're going to take all the bullets when things don't go well. And that's really how you build rapport and trust with your team, and know that they have your back. And I think a lot of it's just, really at the end of the day, trying to be the leader you wish you had. But like I said, you want to emulate the great ones, but I think you can also learn a lot from the poor ones of what I wouldn't want to do. And I think a lot of people try not to reflect on that, but there are some great learnings from that of who and how you wouldn't want to act.
Mm-hmm. You say something so valuable there. And I think that could go with, some of your own leadership blunders. Like, to learn from the leaders that have taught you some of those lessons that you don't want to emulate, but also then to learn from some of the things that you try as a leader that maybe don't go over so well.
Yeah. You have to be willing to try things. And
Mm-hmm.
you have to be willing to grow and develop yourself. I'm a big believer at the end of the day, we're all like trees, we're either growing or dying. So you always want to try and to better yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that comes from just being humble enough, like I said, to ask for help and being humble enough to try things.
Mm-hmm.
And some things are going to work tremendously, and unfortunately, some things are not. But you have to pick yourself up, and you have to be, like I said, vulnerable enough to be able to make mistakes in front of your team, and
Mm-hmm.
probably admit that you made a mistake. We
Mm-hmm.
tried this, it didn't work. Let's regroup. But I think also a lot of it is the other part of that professional mask is being willing to ask your team, how am I doing? What would you like
Mm-hmm.
to see? What could I do differently? I think if you're humble enough to ask some of those questions, I think a lot of your team will be able to answer some of those learnings in the very beginning of how to improve yourself. But then a lot of it's just putting in the work, and there's so much content out there these days, and it's getting easier, every day,
Mm-hmm.
to gain that knowledge. I listened to a podcast with like say Dr. Howard Fran, who said, he has so much content out there now that he could actually do a podcast with himself, interviewing himself, and he could actually talk in his own voice and have his own self answer questions because there's so much out there. And I know AI is the largest buzz in dentistry, but probably one of the most unique things I just heard recently, and you coming from a lot of that leadership mindset, development side of things, you're probably familiar with Gary Keller and Jay Papasan, who wrote the One Thing book,
Mm-hmm.
and they started their own consulting company around that. But Jeff Woods, who helped develop that and work with that with him, he broke off and he just started an AI company for like founders. And I think it's something that practice owners could really use, being that a lot of times when you open up your practice, you don't have the funds, especially if you're newer to dentistry, you still have school debt and a lot of things like that. You've now invested a lot into buying a practice and the real estate and the equipment and everything. And what he's teaching companies to do is to use AI to create your own board of directors that you would never be able to afford.
Mm-hmm.
So like Steve Jobs might be your clinical guy. You might look at dentistry, like Christian Coachman might be your person for implant dentistry, and maybe financial ways. Maybe Warren Buffett's your financial advisor, and you can type into this platform and ask questions of how would I set up my dental practice? What would I do differently? This is the issue I'm having. Maybe it's HR issues, and you could find someone that can help you on that front. Maybe Sheryl Sandberg is like your COO trying to help answer those questions for you. And you can get as in depth as you want and get the answers back. And, that wasn't available back,
Mm-hmm.
a few years back.
Mm-hmm.
But that is something that, you could use that platform and probably, like I said, help develop yourself and help develop your business because ultimately that's what you're doing. You're running a small business. So
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing kind of where the world is kind of morphing to. And I think a lot of people are afraid of AI, but I think it's more AI is not going to take away jobs. It's people that know how to use AI is going to take away jobs. So
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely an interesting way to look at the world and how to improve your business.
Mm-hmm. So much to unpack there, but
Yeah.
a couple things that I really loved that you brought up is, it's important to learn,
Hmm.
but you can only spend so much time learning. You got to
Hmm.
then, like, you got to put the work in, like you said.
Execution. Yep.
Yeah. And what a great segue into AI and how to use that for specifically your unique situation. Because
Hmm.
sometimes you're learning things and you're like, well, this sort of would work in my practice or my business, but my business has these unique features. Well, now plug that into AI and get your answer. That's beautiful.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. It's just interesting where the world's going, and you have to be open to embrace it.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
Yeah.
Yes. So with all of that you've learned through this kind of insecurity behind your professional mask of leadership, what would you tell your younger self now?
I think a lot of it would be just around like just be yourself.
Mm,
You have to be your true self. If you try to, copy what somebody else is doing, it's not going to come out genuine
mm,
or authentic. So I think a lot of it is, like we talked about in the very first question, was if you have a leader that you emulated, it's how do you figure out what's the result they got that you're hoping to get, and how do you kind of transition that and put it into your own way? Like I
mm,
said before, just try to really be the leader you wish you had. And it's really about it trying to inspire, motivate, and lead teams. I mean, motivation has to be kind of within.
mhm,
You can help inspire people, and then discipline has to kick in to take them to the next level.
mhm,
But I think a lot of it's setting the expectations and standards as a leader, but then also realizing you're leading a team of individuals. Everybody learns differently. Everyone wants to be communicated differently. Everyone needs a little bit of different types of inspiration, motivation, to really do that. And I think a lot of it comes down to just having open, transparent communication. I think the more open you are and realizing it's a two-way street, and once again, kind of, treat the people you work with as how you would want to be treated. And then I think some of the other advice I would give myself would be, watch who you surround yourself with. I'm a big believer in the Jim Rohn quote of you're the average of the five people you hang around, and you're probably all falling to the lowest common denominator because that's the easiest place to settle. So I think you always wanted to be like you talked about being able to learn, but be able to execute, but also being around the right people and realizing that I think no one has it all figured out. And then I think if you go past that a little bit, it's really getting mentors, asking for help, like I talked about before. And I think if, mentorship goes a couple different ways. I think the mentor probably a lot of times learns more than the mentee.
Mm.
But there's also with where the world, like we talked about with AI, is morphing and all that. It's great to have reverse mentorship, where you might talk to people who are younger than myself about AI, that, it comes natural to them. I mean, unfortunately, kids, I think, are born with a cell phone in their hand. So they understand technology and all that a lot differently than people our age. But, I think, if you're humble enough to look at reverse mentorship, you can probably get up to speed a lot faster. But that's the goal of being a mentor or a mentee is how do I advance myself at a faster rate than if I try to do it on my own. And I think a lot of it's just probably sitting down with myself and saying, like I said, be yourself, be you, be confident, network, really brand yourself. And then I think a lot of it's just choosing your heart. I think, kind of the whole David Goggins quote of, choose your heart. So, you can either do the easy thing now and the hard's probably going to hit you later, or do the hard work now and it's probably going to get easier later. But I think that's probably the advice that I would give myself and I give other people all the time.
That's beautiful advice. I think that's all worth sharing.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. The mentor-mentee role, I think, is valuable for both people.
Hmm.
And the best mentors and mentees are the ones that recognize that. Like,
Yep. I
so,
would totally agree with that. And I know, like I tell my kids all the time, if you really want to have a great time at a party, go hang out with the 4-year-olds or the 84-year-olds because, the 4-year-olds are just so innocent and what comes out of their mouth is just amazing. And they probably are the best sellers in the world, because they don't understand the word no. So it's fun to listen to them and learn from them and what they think and how they act and what they say. And then, on the flip side, you have the 84-year-olds that, unfortunately are probably on the back nine, probably have some regret. And I think they're more willing to share what we just talked about. Like, what would you tell your younger self? What would you do differently? What would you have changed in your life? And I think you can learn a lot from that. But it's being open to that. And like you said, then being able to take that sage advice and put it to use and how that would apply or to you.
that's a great, I love that you tell your kids that, but it's also a great analogy that you could bring into a workplace
Hmm.
that has a combination of older and younger people and just be like,
Yep.
hey, look at how, tell that story and be like, there's value here in each of your perspectives and let's draw upon that, right?
Absolutely. Like I said before with the mentor-mentee relationship, I think a lot of people don't think about reverse mentorship. You can learn a lot from younger people that are probably starting out in their career. They know a lot of things and do a lot of things that it's been a long time since we've done. And obviously technology and everything changes. So they embrace it a lot quicker and it just allows you to embrace it quicker. So yeah, I think it's not being a closed book and being open to creative new ways of looking at things.
Mm, that's awesome. You know, so much of this has to do with leadership and team. And I know right now, like a big focus for practices is culture around
Hmm.
their team. What do you think is the most impactful way to really develop that culture for a team?
I think a lot of it is having a belief in the team, and like you said, letting everyone have their value. There's a lot of missions and vision statements on walls, that possibly someone created, and sometimes a company created for them. But I think if you could sit down with the whole team and kind of create your own, I think the leader has to kind of set the tone. But I think you'd be amazed at what the whole team could put together. And I think it goes back to a lot of what we've already talked about. I think a lot of it is understanding that everyone is a part of that culture. And culture is not just set from the top down. It can come from the bottom up, and everyone has to kind of meet in the middle to really keep that culture alive and thriving and winning. And I think a lot of it comes down to a lot of some of the stuff we talked about before, treating people the way you'd want to be treated, setting expectations and standards, and really trying to follow that. But I think, especially when it comes to dentistry, I think what's missed a lot of times is, it's really a people business.
Mhm.
I know a lot of dentists don't like the word sales, but, you probably have to sell yourself in the morning of why you have to get up and go to work every day.
Right.
You then got to sell your team on why they should show up and what great we're going to do for patients today. And then on the flip side, to run the business, you have to sell your patients on why dentistry is important, why they need to show up, and why they should accept treatment that we're doing. And we haven't even seen a patient yet. That's probably just kind of before the morning huddle even starts. And we've been selling all day long. And then we start to see patients. And I think a lot of it's just building that vision and that mission for the practice. There's a dental home for everybody.
Mhm.
There's great DSOs out there. There's not so great DSOs. There's great solo practitioners, not so great post solo practitioners. There's a dental home for everybody. You have to find your dental home just as a clinician, as a team member. Same thing for patients. They have to find, their dental home that fits for them. So I think it's really trying to build what you want your business to be and what you want your team and that office to look like and what you want to stand for. And then I think a lot of it's also not only a people business, but getting out in the community because those are the people we serve.
Mhm.
So really trying to embrace the community that you're in and really try to make the best experience. I think the best example I've probably heard is there's a gentleman by the name of Cameron Harold, and he runs the COO network, and he created the COO network because CEOs have their thing, young emerging leaders have their thing. There's always that thing, but there's really nothing for COOs. And so he created this network, and one of the things he always talks about is it's a little morbid, but he talks about like none of us are getting out alive. So at the end of the day, we're probably all just walking each other home. So why not have a great time with it? And I think that comes down to that whole quote of, it's not about the numbers on the front and the back of a tombstone. It's about the dash and the journey. And I think that's what that culture is trying to build that dash
Mhm.
for yourself as the practice owner. The team's going to build their dash, and then you got to build your dash inside the community that you serve. And I think that's how you can really build a successful practice for the long game.
Mhm. That's really poetic and beautiful. I mean, I just think that so often, like you said, that mission statement is just put on the wall and people are
Hmm.
just expected to agree and not agree, uphold, not uphold. And
Yeah.
if we put the people back in first and create it
Hmm.
people first, it might have a little more meaning.
Yeah, I think it's always about, at any level, taking off your shoes and putting on someone else's. I think, if you're a new employee and you consider yourself, lower status, well, a lot of times you don't know what you don't know of how hard it is to run a business. There's a lot of things that keep you up at night. Are you gonna be able to make payroll? There's a lot of things you don't think through of decisions that are made. And then I think, sometimes as you elevate, you kind of forget what it's like to start out.
Mhm.
Everybody was a beginner once. So sometimes you don't take into account, their feelings, their shoes to put on and figure that out. But I think the more you can have that, like I said, consistent communication and treat people fairly, I think that's where you really build that culture.
Mhm. Yeah, so good. So good. Well, you know, aside from culture, you're sitting in front of a screen that's just full of water.
Hmm.
And we know that water is a pretty important part of dentistry. And there's not much that goes on in the dental day without water.
Yeah.
So, what is one overlooked aspect of water quality that you think practices should prioritize?
Yeah, I mean, I truly believe it's the greatest time to be in dentistry. And like you said, water is the number one instrument used in a dental practice. It's utilized in almost every aspect of dentistry. But based on how it works in a practice is very similar to how it works in your house. You just turn a faucet and you hope it comes on. Well, there's parts of the world that wish they had that faucet in their house that they could turn on. So a lot of times it's overlooked and overvalued of what it means to have clean water. So I think probably one of the biggest issues is based on that fact and based on a lot of what we work with in my business is in, a mechanical room or it's in tubing and piping that you don't see. So it is overlooked. So, the statistics we always hear is about 70% of dental practices don't test, treat, or shock their water lines,
Whoa,
which
whoa,
is
whoa, whoa.
pretty scary.
70%?
70%. And I think it's one of those things where we don't know, we don't know, or we know, and we just kind of overlook that.
Mm,
So, you really have to make sure you do due diligence in that. And I think one of the things that I have conversations all the time is Ohio State University did a study showing that the aerosols that come out of a water line, and
mm,
it's not just about the water coming out into the practice from the municipalities, or if you're using distilled water, it's more about you're talking about small lining tubing that is primed for bacteria, biofilm, everything like that for to grow. And practices aren't open 24 hours a day, so it's not like a river where it's always flowing.
mm,
So a lot of times it's just not thought about, not looked upon. But Ohio State did a study, and this gets a lot of clinicians and a lot of team members to kind of look sideways as well, not just for the patient aspect of it, but their studies show that 79% of the aerosols that the team members and clinicians are breathing in are coming straight out of the water lines.
mm.
And if you're not too diligent in shocking and treating those water lines, you're probably breathing in all that biofilm and bacteria,
Wow.
which is not a great thing. And that's why a lot of team members say, there are a lot of sinus infections, upper respiratory infections, things like that from the team members. And you probably just assume I got it from the grocery store, the mall, the movies, something like that, traveling in the airport.
Mm,
It could not come out of those water lines. But that's a reason that entices teams to take a little more action. But then, the last thing anybody wants is an outbreak. So that's where you really have to be due diligent. And I applaud you because I know in our last conversation you said it was something that you took seriously
mm,
in your practice, but not everyone does that.
mhm,
And dentistry is about making money. And this is something that may not make you money. It might cost you money in the long run,
mm,
but it's not about making money. So sometimes that, unfortunately, that's the items that are overlooked. But that's where we spend a lot of our time helping to keep offices safe and compliant and making sure they have a protocol in place. And more importantly, that people are following the protocol.
mm,
Kind of like we talked about the mission and vision on the wall. Well, a lot of people have protocols, but people aren't following the protocol.
mm, mm,
And obviously there's a lot of turnover in dental practices right now. So that makes it even more challenging to make sure we're following those protocols and people are trained appropriate. But I had spent 20 years in dentistry before I joined Solmetex, and water wasn't something I thought about either.
mm,
I was mostly in the hygiene space and implant dentistry space, and it's not something you normally think about in dentistry. But when you really learn that it's used in every aspect of dentistry and it's in the operatory on almost every procedure, yeah, you can't work without a compressor and a vacuum, but you also can't work without water. But that's not the one people think about. They think about the compressor and vacuum.
mm. So I'm curious if there's somebody listening right now and they're like, we don't do this with our water. What's the first thing they should do? How should they start the process of looking into to getting their water shocked and treated?
Well, obviously, I'm pretty biased. I think they should reach out to my company. But there are a lot of resources out there from the CDC, from ADS, or used to be OSAP. There's a lot of resources out there to help you get started.
Mhm,
But I think a lot of it is what we talked about before. Reach out for help.
mm,
Sometimes you don't know what you don't know,
mm,
and if you're not testing your water lines, you don't know. You could also be treating your lines. but you never shock your lines and you never test your lines. It's the same thing if you own a swimming pool.
Mm,
You can treat them, but if you're never shocking the pool or never testing how the water's doing, you don't really know. You just
mm,
assume everything's good,
mm,
and you probably don't know till someone gets sick.
mm,
So I think a lot of it's just asking for help, reaching out. Our organization, that's what we do every day, is try to help people from an end-to-end water solution,
mm,
handling everything from water in, through, and out of the practice. So we're the only comprehensive organization that handles all those aspects.
mm.
Other people just touch a portion of it. So we can really help them all across the board.
That's awesome. So they give
Yeah.
you a call. What's the first step after that initial conversation,
I
typically?
think the first step is really asking them, currently, what are you doing?
Mm,
Do you have a protocol in place? And then, unfortunately, money's the answer. What's the question? You can build out a protocol, you can build out a compliance thing, but you have to figure out, what works for you. And we understand it's a lot easier to sign the back of a check than the front of a check. So we really try to work with them of what is the best protocol for them. How do they want to keep not only their team members, but also their patients and the environment safe.
mm,
Because, a lot of this doesn't impact the environment as well.
mm,
And like I said, there's parts of the country that, would love to have a faucet that they could just walk into to a bathroom or a kitchen and turn it on.
mm,
That's not the norm outside the US and a lot of parts of the world.
mm,
So we have to really protect that and value that we have that. But I think a lot of it's just, reaching out, and we can really work with them to figure out what is the best protocol for them. And like I said, some are doing nothing, some are doing pieces of it. But there are some doing everything, and it's various reasons.
mm,
They believe in it. Others don't want to have something happen, don't want to get caught. There are some laws in place in certain states where you have to test and treat your water.
mm,
On the amalgam side, there's a federal law that you kind of have to follow the amalgam rule. But a lot of it's just reaching out, and we can have a consultation with you of what's the best way to get you on track. It's
mm,
not about blame or shame.
mm,
It's about really trying to help everybody, because the goal is, how do we get more people to embrace dentistry?
mm,
If you look at most statistics prior to COVID, it showed probably about 40% of patients in the US didn't go to the dentist. Now it's kind of showing 50 to 60% don't go to the dentist.
mm,
And then if you want to call it dental insurance, it's really a subsidy or coupon. But people that have that dental benefit, half in the US don't even use it.
mm,
So, it's more about how do we increase that opportunity for patients to value their oral health
mm,
along with their overall health, and we're seeing those connections. And water plays an important role in place in that, of how do we all band together to increase that. Capacity probably really isn't the issue. Unless you're in a small town with 100 people and you have a dental practice there, then capacity probably is an issue. But you hear people, like I said, came from 20 years in the hygiene world. You had people bragging that, we can't get a patient in for six to 8 months. It's like, that's not a good thing.
mm,
If you diagnose periodontal disease and you can't get somebody in for 6 to 8 months, that's not a good thing.
mm,
That's a bad situation to have. You wouldn't see that in the cancer world.
mm,
So we really try to work with praxis to really create, like you talked about, that culture, that environment. You should brag if you're doing this when a lot of your peers aren't taking water seriously in your practice.
mm,
That is what I think is becoming more the norm, that, people want to look and, what are your ratings? What are your Google reviews? How is this office set up? What is the feel of this office? Is this someplace I want to be?
mm,
Versus, if the ratings aren't good, or if you cut a water line in an operatory and black worms come squirting
mm,
out, that's probably not a place you want to sit down and be treated at. But like I said, there's a dental home for everybody. Our job is like I said, not to do shame or blame. It's really trying to make you have the best practice you can ever have, and really set up your life to be successful, whether that be sale, exit, whatever the goal of that clinician's practice is.
mm. I think you highlighted something so magical there, in the sense that, I know that certain practices will take a patient on a tour of the office and show them
Hmm.
all the fancy gadgets and the high tech things that they have. But you could add into that tour how you treat your water, and how you
Hmm.
make sure that ensure that that water is as clean as possible for the patient, for the team members, for the environment in their community. And that
Absolutely.
that might be a really impactful message that you
Mhm.
deliver to that patient that could then stimulate some internal referrals, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have certificates for things like that when people are passing their tests, when they're doing that, and it's a great thing to share. And unfortunately, in dentistry, a lot of times, websites are built to probably impress other dental practices because patients they don't understand what a lot of this language is or really what's going on in the practice, but they understand water. They
Mm-hmm.
understand clean water.
Mm-hmm.
That water's not the only thing. There's other things you could represent that you do that you take OSHA. You take cleaning the practice, a lot of things very important. I think the more you can kind of share those things, that's what people are more impressed with instead of talking about we have a laser or this is the type of x-rays we take or we have an iTero scanner. They don't know what any of that is. They don't know what that does, but that's what they like to show and tour and talk to people about. And if you don't really give them the why behind all that, they're just kind of walking through an office having really no idea what's going on. And it's not about the cookies that we baked, so it smells like cookies, or there's a bottled water station out front. Some people appreciate that, but I think a lot of people, they're there because they want to get healthy. And like I
Mm-hmm.
said, if we have that 40% of the population that's there to 40 to 50% to get healthy, we have to start explaining things to them of what we're doing, why we're doing it. Even like oral cancer screening, so
Mm-hmm.
many of those are performed and they're never telling them what they're doing. Which, if you're going to go through the process of doing all this work, you might as well explain to them what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what's the benefit to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think too, and I want to highlight that that study that you brought up about the aerosols that the team is breathing, and just why are we doing this? We're doing this for our patients, but we're also doing it for our health,
Mhm.
and that's a great buy-in for the team, and then they feel, oh, you really care about me, you care about my health, and that goes a long way, I think, for a leader.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things like you talked about. It's how you build culture. That's how you build a team. That's how you build respect. That's how you build, especially with all the staffing shortage that people talk about. The more you value the team, the more the team wants to value you and help build whatever you're a part of. But I think a lot of it's bringing them along that
Mm-hmm.
journey as well of being part of the team and looking out for them. So that is stuff that money can't provide, that feeling.
Yeah. Oh boy, that you have so many good mic drops in this podcast. I
Well, I
think this is
appreciate
better
that.
than our first conversation. So way to go.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Oh, well, listen, for our listeners that are curious about you and what you do, or Solmetex or water or anything at all, what's the best way to get a hold of you? What's the best way to follow what you're doing or learn more?
Yeah, I think a lot of you can always reach me at my email is scraig@solmetex.com. You can always go to my LinkedIn profile. There's not a lot of Steve Craigs out there, but you can definitely find me pretty fast. We can communicate through that. I think that's how you and I first met.
Mhm.
What was through LinkedIn and reach out to our organization. We have dedicated people. This is all we do all day long is helping people get back on track. So we're more than willing to help out anyone that needs that.
Mhm. That's fantastic. Well, thanks for sharing that. And we'll make sure and include all of that in our show notes below.
Awesome.
So, listeners, if you're driving, don't worry. You can find those links in the show notes.
Absolutely.
And just to leave us here with something, what is a great way? You talked about AI and you talked about the changing world of dentistry. What do you think is a something that practices can do to ensure that they're just not reacting to change, but actually embracing it, in your leadership opinion?
Where I'd love to see dentistry get, and I think it's starting to get there with AI, with AI and everything going on, is around getting more proactive. Dentistry has always been a little more reactive. We love to fix broken things, but how do we kind of enter more of the medicine world? I know Steve Thorne at PDS talks about this all the time of, the oral health and mental health and physical health of how do we tie that medical dental integration together. And I think, a lot of it stems, from that of looking at the mouth and the head is connected to the body. How do we really relay that to the public, relay that to everybody? And I think if we all band together, we probably wouldn't see 60% of the population not going to the dentist. I think we
Mhm.
would see that dramatically change. There's so many studies out there showing what the ramifications of poor oral health and what it does to other disease states. I think it's past the point of not knowing what the cause and effect is. I think we now realize that the whole body is impacted by that, and I think the more we can all band together around that, I think it's a beautiful thing for dentistry.
Mm. Yeah,
But
that's
more
awesome.
importantly, it's a beautiful thing for patients.
Right, right. That's beautiful. I 100% agree with you there. Love to see that just so much more talked about just as an everyday topic with everybody. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, I want to go to the dentist because I want to be healthy in all areas of my body, right?
Yeah, and I think AI is tremendously helping that with diagnostic tools, with second opinion tools. A product like Curodont from Vivardis out that can reverse carious lesions, something like that. Without AI, you'd still be the naked eye looking at that.
Mhm.
So I think we're finally getting to that point where we're really looking at preventative dentistry as preventative medicine. And I think, the more we can get that medical dental integration, I think it's a great thing for patients.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, this has been a joy. I'm so glad that you opted to spend a little time with us and our listeners today. Thank you so much for being here. And is there anything else that we didn't touch on today that you want to make sure we know about with you?
No, like I said, feel free to reach out. I'm willing to make connections on LinkedIn, whether it's around leadership, advice, mentorship, whether it's around dental water, whether it's around dentistry as a whole. I'm a podcast junkie, so I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I think the Mint Door podcast is one that people need to listen to.
Oh,
So that it's not just about that learning and developing. It's also everything's in your mind, so you need to have that mental health aspect of everything, really trying to develop yourself. But like you said, it's how do you learn advice, and how do you put it into execution and action. And I
mhm.
think you guys do a tremendous job of covering that in kind of a different side of dentistry. So I think it's a phenomenal help for the community out there.
Oh, well, I really appreciate that. Thank you for saying that. That makes my day. And, follow Steve on LinkedIn. You have great posts. When I see them, I always enjoy them. They're always very informative or enlightening or make me think a little bit. So I appreciate your posting on LinkedIn. So make sure follow Steve on LinkedIn as well. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
you're welcome. All right, listeners, we hope you found some encouragement from today's podcast and know that we adore you. We'll see you on the next episode of the Mint Door Podcast. Take care.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks for listening and subscribe for more holistic performance content.